Well, how we doing, neighborhood? Well, it's great to be with you on this wonderful Easter Sunday. If we've not met, my name's Forrest. I'm on the team here. And have you ever come across one of those kids, or maybe you were one of those kids, no matter what anybody was saying, the comeback was, prove it. Right? Were you one of those kids, like that's just a classic two-word kid comeback for almost anything? Prove it. Just prove it, right? I can dunk a basketball. Prove it. I can do a 360 on a skateboard. Prove it. Most elephants weigh less than the tongue of a blue whale. That's true, by the way. Prove it, right? Well, let me ask. When it comes to proving it, have you ever felt like saying, prove it, to all this Jesus stuff? I mean, I certainly have. I mean, just think about it for 1 minute. Here's a first century Jewish carpenter turned respected religious teacher who claims that he's the creator God in human form who's arrived on planet Earth to show us mere mortals the way to live and the way to be in relationship with the divine. I mean, honestly, if there was ever a time worth saying, prove it, I think it's with this Jesus guy because his claims are so big, outrageous, even outlandish. In fact, the people who first encountered Jesus, they actually went around saying to him, you're gonna need to prove that. Prove it, Jesus. You can't just run around saying crazy stuff without a little evidence, right? And here's the thing, Jesus responded to them. He said, all right, I will give you some proof that validates what I'm doing and what I'm saying. And he always gave the same evidence, which means we should ask, well, then what was it? What was Jesus' proof that validated everything else he said and did, right? What was the evidence, right? What did he point to? Well, here's the thing. Jesus' proof, it was so big, so strong, and so clear that we're actually still talking about it today, nearly 2,000 years after the fact. And here's his proof. The moment where he said, this will validate everything I've been saying and doing for the last 3 years. Here's Jesus' big proof. It's Easter. It's Easter. Coming back to life from death, the resurrection. Right? Let me show you. Let me show you just one example where Jesus is sort of in the middle of a conversation and he's asked to prove it and how Jesus responds. So Jesus is talking to some religious leaders. They're called Pharisees and teachers of the law, but they're basically pastors. So then some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to him, teacher, they're talking to Jesus, we want to see a sign from you. This is the Bible way of saying, Jesus, prove it. Prove it. Here's how Jesus responds. He answered, a wicked and adulterous generation. That's how I feel about millennials, just so we're clear. So Jesus answered, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given except, I'll prove it, fellas. Right, so then he was about to point to, if you wouldn't call yourself a Bible person, there's a story in Jesus' Bible, the Jewish scripture, the Christian Old Testament, about a guy who gets swallowed by a big fish and then gets spit out 3 days later. So this is Jesus sort of pointing to this. It says, none will be given, but except, here's the proof, the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man, sometimes Jesus talked about himself by calling himself the Son of Man. So the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the earth. So this is some religious leaders going, Jesus, you got to prove it. Give us a sign. And he says, fine, I'll prove it. I will actually be dead and buried for 3 days, but I will come back out the heart of the earth. Over and over again, Jesus made it clear that the one sign, the one test, right, whether or not he is who he says he is, had everything to do for him with Easter, with him coming back to life from the dead. People said, prove it. He said, okay, I will rise from the dead. And because of that, like whether or not he did, it's everything. Like, I mean, if we can't figure this out, then really we can't figure any of it out. In fact, we could go and we should go as far as saying, Easter, today, this is the anchor of the Christian faith. And it's not so because I said so, but because Jesus, when he was challenged to prove it, he said, let me tell you about Easter. It's his proof for everything else he said and did. Which means if Easter is true, if the resurrection is true, if Jesus really did do all of that, that really is the evidence, it's game on for all things Jesus. But if the resurrection did not happen, right, then it's game over because everything, just get rid of it all. Because everything hangs on this one event in history that Christians run around referring to as the resurrection. At least that's what Jesus said when he was asked to prove it. The resurrection of Jesus. This is what launched what we call the church today. The resurrection of Jesus. This is what launched what we call Christianity, right? Before the resurrection, there's no Christians, right? When Jesus was crucified, everybody just thought Jesus was going to do what other dead people do. Stay dead, right? It was a complete surprise. When they looked into the empty tomb on that first Easter Sunday, no one was running around saying, he's alive, he's alive, he's alive, isn't it so cool? No, they looked into the empty tomb and they said, they stole the body, we gotta go find the body. Nobody saw the resurrection coming. Even though Jesus, he ran around, he was a little cryptic for sure, but he ran around for 3 years kind of telling everybody exactly what would happen. He said, listen, I've been challenged enough with this prove it business, so here the proof is on its way. I will rise from the dead. So everything. Like there's no wiggle room in this. Everything hinges on the idea of the resurrection. With it, we've got something to talk about. Without it, you should get out your phones right now and see if VP has any more reservations for brunch, because that's, right? There's just no reason to even show up. Even, in fact, this is crazy, even the guys that wrote the Christian Bible, we call it the New Testament today, even when they wrote, they were talking about how important the resurrection is, because without it, we might as well get rid of everything, including the Bible. And so there's this early convert. He wasn't like an original kind of follower of Jesus, but a very early convert. His name was Paul. And Paul one day was writing a letter to some Christians that lived in an ancient city called Corinth. Corinth is in Greece. It's just about 65 miles to the southwest of Athens. And he writes them a letter that summarizes Easter, if you will. And I just want to walk through this. And so a couple things I need you to remember for the rest of the morning. I need you to remember that this guy's name is Paul. He's writing a bunch of letters. One of them we call 1 Corinthians, and it's written to Christians in an actual city. And here's what he says to them. He says, listen, now brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel. Maybe you've heard that word kind of thrown around and you've wondered what it meant. Well, Paul is about to tell us, what it means. He said, listen, I preached to you, which you received and on which you've taken your stand. In other words, this is the foundation of everything. This is what we're going to get into. By this gospel, you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you've believed in vain. For what I received, right? Somebody told Paul what he's now telling these Corinthian folks, right? For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. Here it is. Here's what Paul thinks this gospel is. That Christ died for our sins, according to the scriptures. That he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day, right? That's it. There it is, right? And then he appeared, right? So he walks out of the tomb, and now he's showing himself to people, right? Then he appeared to Cephas. Also, Cephas, his name is Peter oftentimes. So Cephas and Peter, those are like the same person. And then to the 12, he goes on. Here's more evidence. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Now, here's what's interesting. A couple of things. Number one, Paul is literally saying to the people in ancient Corinth, fact check me. You don't buy it? You don't buy what I'm selling? Then go ask the people that were there. They're still alive. Some are gone, but but they're still alive. So if you're not buying what I'm selling, go ask them. They were there. Go fact check me. And here's just a little side note. It's kind of interesting. The early Christians never talked about dead people being dead. They always talked about dead people being asleep. And here's why they did that. Because asleep people wake up. And their belief in the resurrection, their confidence in the resurrection was so strong that they couldn't even talk about death as just somebody being dead. No, they talked about it as simply falling asleep because they believed that they would wake up with Jesus, right? So this is Paul. He's simply saying, and we're going to kind of go back through this line by line a little bit in just a second, but this is Paul saying the resurrection is everything. What Easter represents is everything, right? And that's why today, for just a couple of minutes, if you'll hang with me, I just want to look at Jesus's prove it moment. Because when it comes to Christianity, and it comes to, is there any validity to this idea of Christianity? We've got to deal with Easter. We've got to address the resurrection because Jesus said everything else actually doesn't matter. The resurrection is what validates and affirms everything I ever said or did. So I want to look at Jesus's proof claim and see if there's any merit to it. And here's why I want to do that. Because I want everyone in this room to believe in the resurrection. Because I believe in the resurrection, and I actually believe, and I have done a lot of homework. I believe there's overwhelming evidence that supports the resurrection of Jesus. And I know some of you are here who already believe in the resurrection, but sometimes you wonder, right? You wonder, could it really have happened? Don't dead people stay dead? And that's okay. Don't worry about wondering. We all wonder from time to time. The resurrection is a preposterous claim. And I know some of you are here who don't wonder if it really happened or not. You wonder how anyone in their right mind could possibly believe that a dead Jewish rabbi living in Israel almost 2,000 years ago could possibly come back to life. Some of you think this is just crazy and there's no way. And listen, if that's you today, all I hope to do is I just hope I can remove one objection. If you were to ever take the claims of Jesus seriously, I hope today just gives you enough food for thought. That's what I hope. But then there's a third group, I think, in here. And some of you, you grew up believing, right? You did the whole thing. You went to church, you went to summer camp, you dedicated your life, you were baptized, the whole deal. But then you grew up and life started to happen, and you brought some of your tough questions, and all you got from your tough adult questions was little kid Sunday school answers. And in the process, you lost your faith. And you're wondering, is it ever possible for me to believe again? And for you, I hope the next few moments is just simply a stepping stone back to your childhood faith. And what I find so interesting, and why we just read what we read. So I think for all three of those groups, for those of you who believe but sometimes wonder, for those of you who wonder how anyone could possibly believe, and for those of you that would love it if you could possibly believe again, for all three of you, I think the key for all of us is found in the passage of the little letter that Paul wrote nearly 2,000 years ago. I think the passage shows us the way forward, actually, right? And here's why I say this. Listen, the primary argument against the legitimacy of Christianity is the resurrection. And it should be, because if it didn't happen, let's go home. After all, it is an insane claim. The objection goes something like this. The resurrection is a myth resulting from multiple decades of storytelling that was exaggerated and changed over time to suit the agenda of later generations of Christians. That's pretty much the objection. In other words, people told stories, and then those people told stories, and then the next generation told stories. I mean, think of it as like an elaborate, sort of centuries-long childhood game of telephone, right? And by the time any of this actually gets written down, so much time had gone by, all the eyewitnesses are dead, a lot of it's now just fabricated, making Jesus out to be something Jesus never claimed to be, and certainly Jesus never really was. The resurrection, in other words, is nothing more than a massive exaggeration of what actually occurred. And today, for just one moment, I just want to gently push back on that argument. I just want to maybe give us another option with the few moments that I have left. I want to explain one of the reasons I have extraordinary confidence in the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And the first thing, so here's the thing. If you were here last week, one of our teaching pastors, Jordan, was up here, and Jordan, when he's up here and I'm out of town, he often makes fun of me, and he did that last week. Again, being the boss does not matter here. Like, it's just, and he made a crack, and he said, listen, when I'm up here, I'm going to tell you, stories about, wrestling and him going to watch The Rock, but when Forrest is up here, he gives you history lessons and tells you crazy stuff, and, well, that's what you get today. So no wrestling stories, so I need you to hang in and kind of buckle in for how I'm going to explain this, but we've got great pictures, so you should be fine. So here's the first thing you need to know. One of the reasons why I have extraordinary confidence in the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, and why I don't buy the centuries-long, sort of elaborate childhood game of telephone sort of push against the resurrection. I just don't buy that, and here I'm about to tell you why. And the first thing we need to know is that Paul, who wrote this letter to the Corinthians, everybody agrees. Like, nobody disagrees. Every scholar on the planet, both Christian and not Christian, they agree that Paul was real. That he was a real guy, that he wrote the letter of 1 Corinthians, right? He's not a made-up Bible person. Everybody agrees that Paul lived in the first century and he had extraordinary influence on Christianity. Now, here's what else you need to know. Paul was a prolific writer. 1 Corinthians was one of 13 letters of Paul's that make it into the Bible. Now, here's where there's a little bit of debate. Many people say, listen, we don't think Paul wrote all 13. There's 6 that are pretty debated. Could be Paul, could not be Paul. But 7 of those 13, everybody agrees Paul wrote. No respected scholar disputes that Paul wrote 7 of those 13 letters for sure. And one of the letters that he for sure wrote was this 1 Corinthians that we just read from. Everyone agrees that Paul wrote that letter. Now, he wrote it, this is where the pictures come in, so just hang with me because this is so important. I can't even overstate how important this is. Paul wrote it in the year 55. He wrote the letter to the Corinthians in the year 55. Not like 1955, but, like just 55, right? So there's only been 55. So some scholars would date it even earlier, 51, but for our purposes today, we're going to go with the date 55. Now, hang with me. I'm going to give you a timeline, and this timeline is so important. And, if you are not good with math, that's the pictures. So just listen to me, but look up there, and you should be okay. Now, here's the other thing that no credible scholar disagrees on: Jesus. Nobody disagrees that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical figure who claimed to be a Jewish teacher sent from God who lived in the first century Israel, and he was crucified. He was executed by Rome somewhere between the years 30 and 33. Got it? So track with me. Paul, real-life historical figure, wrote a letter to the Christians in Corinth in the year 55, undisputed. Nobody argues this. Jesus, also real-life historic figure, was executed for crimes against the state by the Roman Empire, and let's just call it the year 32. Undisputed by respected scholars, right? So here's what I want you to see. The gap that exists between the death and resurrection of Jesus and Paul writing his letter to the Corinthians talking about the resurrection, it's just 23 years. It's not a centuries-long game of telephone. It's not an elaborate ruse or hoax. Now here's what's interesting, is that the letter that Paul's writing, if you noticed, it's all in the past tense, as in he's already actually had a conversation with these people, and he's just reminding them of it, right? And this conversation, he's there. He's actually in Corinth hanging out with people in the year 52. Let me just show you some examples. From the letter, from the passage we just read, Paul writes this: "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind," as in, remember when we talked about it 3 years ago? "I want to remind you of the gospel," Jesus walked out of a grave, "that I preached to you," again, live and in person, right? He's reminding them of what he taught them in the year 52, that he's now writing to them about in the year 55. He says this: "For what I received, I passed on to you." Like, again, it's all past tense, we've had some experience, we've got shared memory together, right, of first importance. And here's what else I want to show you. Notice he says, "For what I received." Because Paul's about to tell them what someone else told him, right? He didn't make it up. This is Paul saying, I'm about to tell you what somebody told me that I told you when I was with you. You tracking? Because it's about to get worse. When I was with you, I told you what they told me. Now I'm writing about what I told you that they told me that I told you when I was with you. We're good, right? Everybody's clear? Paul's saying, I didn't make this up. I didn't make it up, right? I'm just passing along what I've been taught. And what had he been taught? He told us. So what I received, there it is, right? I passed on to you as of first importance. Christ died, he was buried, and what everybody argues about, he was raised on the third day. Now, if you're still paying attention, let me recap. Just keep looking at the screens. You'll be okay. Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians in 55 after teaching them in person that Jesus rose from the dead in 52, right? So now all this means is Paul is writing and talking about the resurrection of Jesus just 20 years after the event. Now, if you're 25, 20 is like, whoa, that's a long time. If you're 46, like me, 20 years is like, I've had friends longer than 20 years, right? I remember my early 20s vividly, right? Here's my point. Paul clearly believed Jesus rose from the dead 20 years after the event. And then he said, somebody told me Jesus rose from the dead before that. Paul was not an eyewitness to the resurrection. Now, here's the other thing you should know. Paul, this is not the first time Paul's talking and writing about the resurrection. In fact, we know that Paul got on a ship and he went out to an island in the Mediterranean called Cyprus, and he told the people in Cyprus all about the resurrection of Jesus. And we know that Paul is in Cyprus in the year 44. Right? Now, if you're a math person, you know that we've just taken our timeline down from 23 years now to just 12 years after Jesus' crucifixion and possible resurrection. This is not an elaborate game of telephone. This is now just 12 years. And Paul said he knew Jesus rose from the dead because somebody else told him about it. To which we need to say, wait. Before us, we were told the resurrection is a legend that grew up over time through a fancy game of telephone and was never written about until decades or even centuries after all the eyewitnesses had died. And it was written about so that people could gain and earn and have power, right? That's why we made up the resurrection. But now you know. Now you know. This is not even disputed. Now you know that sitting in your Bibles is a letter that every respected scholar on the planet, Christian and non-Christian, affirm that Paul wrote. And that in it, he talks about Jesus' death and resurrection, and it was only 23 years after the fact. And in this letter, you have Paul saying, what I'm telling you, someone else told me. Well, who told Paul? Well, remember we mentioned that guy Cephas, Peter, right? Here's what he says in the letter. He says, listen, remember he appeared to Peter, one of his good friends. So here's what we have, if you're following. 12 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, Paul's taking trips, claiming that Peter was an eyewitness, believed Jesus walked out of a tomb. Not 20, not 30, not 40, not 50 years, just 12 years after the crucifixion, right? So here's another question. How did Paul know that Peter believed Jesus rose from the dead? How did he know that? It's not like there were cell phones or email or anything. Well, he tells us in another one of those undisputed letters called Galatians. Called Galatians because it was written to some Christians in the Roman province of a place called Galatia. And in it, he says this. Then after 3 years, so that's significant. He's been a Christian now 3 years. He's converted. I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas, Peter, and I stayed with him a couple of weeks, and I saw no one else except James, who is the half-brother of Jesus. So now, the meeting between Paul, Peter, and James, we know happened right around the year 40. Well, doesn't that move our timeline even closer? Now we're just 8 years from the actual event of Jesus' death and resurrection. And Paul tells us that this meeting happened 3 years after he converted. So now it's 8 years. What was 8 years is now just 5 years. 5 years after the death and resurrection, we actually have historical evidence that would point to the fact that Peter and James and others are in Jerusalem running around telling people that Jesus was alive. Now, I could keep going, but I know this is all you can handle. Like, that's a lot. I get it. But isn't that kind of interesting? When you consider there's an awful lot of people running around saying it's an elaborate hoax. It was told and retold and retold and exaggerated and leveraged so people could gain power and control the masses and all of that. I don't buy that. I don't buy it. I admit Paul's letter to the Corinthians is not irrefutable proof that Jesus rose from the dead. I know I didn't definitively prove it this morning when it comes to the resurrection. But I hope you can at least say that Paul's letter is dang strong evidence that when Paul wrote this letter, there were already people and had already been people living in Jerusalem who believe, and they were eyewitnesses, and believed Jesus rose from the dead. They watched him die, and now their story is he's alive. Paul's letter is evidence that the resurrection is not a product of decades or centuries of storytelling. No, Paul's letter is evidence that the resurrection was actually being taught and documented while the eyewitnesses were still alive. Now, this is valid. You might be saying, yeah, okay, fine, Forrest, great timeline, very pretty. But what if Paul's a liar? Right? Well, I mean, maybe. But here's the thing. Nobody's actually ever accused him of lying. Not then and certainly not now. No respectable scholar in the history of the world's ever accused Paul of being a liar. In fact, I mean, if you go to big universities, you can actually just get a degree in Paul. Did you know that? Like, not a Christian degree, just like a degree in this guy, Paul. And here's the thing. Nobody calls Paul a liar because his life validated his belief. Nobody disputes that Paul's an educated man, a Roman citizen, Jewish religious leader that converts to Christianity, leaves home, leaves wealth, leaves his family, leaves his entire belief system, got on a ship, traveled around to all the major port cities of the Mediterranean, and told people that Jesus rose from the dead. Nobody argues that. And nobody else, okay, so maybe he's not a liar. What if he's just crazy? I mean, maybe he thought something was true that wasn't true because he was a little cuckoo. Well, okay, but nobody actually has ever accused Paul of being crazy. And no one accuses Paul of being crazy because when you read Paul's letters, and I strongly recommend you doing that, you'll find out quick, this man is a towering intellect. His letters are sophisticated, they're logical, and they're honestly, and again, historians argue, they're nothing short of brilliant. And that's why today, now, just you could go study Paul. That's how smart he was. Now today, 2,000 years later, people just want to go study one man. That's how smart he was. And if all we had was Paul's letter to the Christians in Corinth, here's what we'd know. We'd know the Bible didn't create Christianity. It's not like somebody, hey, I know, let's convince everybody to believe something crazy. And so they wrote it down and then said, hey, look, the Bible, it's a sacred text. No, the Bible didn't create it. If all we had was Paul's letter, this scrap that I just showed you, if all we had was that, we would know the Bible didn't create Christianity because the Bible didn't exist for several hundred years after Paul wrote the letter. We'd know Christians didn't create Christianity decades or centuries later. It's amazing. If all we had was this one letter that no one disputes Paul wrote, and everyone agrees Paul's telling the truth and that he's not crazy. If all we had was that one letter, the only conclusion that we could come to regarding why you and I are here 2,000 years after the first Easter, celebrating the first Easter, is that on that first Easter, Jesus really did come back to life. The resurrection really did happen. Then here's the thing. It changed everything. And it still is changing everything. The foundation of the Christian faith is Easter. It's the resurrection. Easter's so important because it was Jesus' way of saying, I'll prove it. Jesus, you're saying and doing some pretty bizarre things. Prove it. All right, I will. And he walked out of a tomb after being in it for 3 days. Because of the resurrection, Everything Jesus said and did is validated, which means we now know that there's a God and that this God is personal and relational. We can believe in things like heaven and assume that it's real, not because we were told that as kids, not because somebody is just trying to make you feel better, not because someone like me says it at a funeral so that you can walk away believing you're going to reconnect with your loved one. No, we know heaven's real because Jesus taught there was a heaven. And if the resurrection happened, then it confirms everything Jesus taught. If Jesus rose from the dead, then we're free to accept Jesus' interpretation of his own life. The resurrection punctuated Jesus' power and authority, his capacity to forgive sin. Do you know what that means for you? It means that forgiveness is available to you and that you're loved by God. And now you're free to love as he loved, and you're free to forgive as he forgave. Resurrection is a claim that nothing can ever stay the same. And in our darkest moments when we all cry out, God, is it always going to be like this? The resurrection answers that question and says, no, it's not always going to be like this. The world will be made new. Right? That we believe we've been baptized in a culture that says, listen, here's how the world works. People stay dead. Dead people stay dead. If someone hurts you, go ahead and hurt them back, right? If you screwed up, you should be punished. And bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. But the resurrection is like, no, none of that works. It's not a great way to live. The resurrection says, hey, there's this whole other new way to live. And now death isn't the end, and forgiveness is possible, and love can change the world way more than revenge or violence or hate. That Jesus came to reboot the whole way the world is supposed to operate. Because of the resurrection, there's now a different way to live. Because of the resurrection, now there's hope, and love is real, and redemption is possible. Because of the resurrection, we know that God is for us, and that now we are free to go be for each other. And I guess I just have one question in all of that. Why wouldn't you want to be part of it? Right? I mean, if I'm right, I mean, that timeline's fairly compelling. I mean, if Jesus really did walk out of a tomb, I mean, why fight that? Why stay stuck in a rather ugly way of living when the resurrection invites you into something so much more beautiful? Why wouldn't you want to be a part of that? I don't know. I'm going to pray in just a moment. But before I do, I want us to do a very churchy thing. So if you're not a church person, or you're here and you're still not convinced, so you don't have to do this, but we're going to do it anyway. Because Jesus people have been doing this for 1,600 years. It's pretty cool. I got to get up. They're going to move this. For 1,600 years, Jesus people have been doing the same thing on Easter. Here's what they would do. On Easter, you'd walk up to somebody and you would say, "He is risen." And then that person, this was a way of greeting, that person would respond, "He is risen indeed." This started happening just 400 years after the whole Jesus death and resurrection thing. So now, for 1,600 years, people like you and I, if you're here and you're a follower of Jesus, this is how we greet each other, especially on Easter. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the "He is risen" part, and you're going to do the "He is risen indeed" part. Does that sound okay? And again, you don't have to participate, especially if you're like Forrest, your timeline was cute, but you're crazy, right? That's fine. You don't have to do it. But if you think maybe that I'm onto something, participate. Ready? So I'm going to say "He is risen." You say "He is risen indeed." He is risen. He is risen indeed. And we all said, amen. Let me pray. Father, thanks. Thanks so much for Easter, for resurrection, the hope and life that it brings. And remind us that resurrection isn't just something to believe in because of a timeline. The resurrection is actually something to live and lean into and receive as hope and forgiveness and grace, compassion, love. Help us to be Easter kind of people, not just today, but every day. Jesus, we love you and we are so very grateful for you, the cross, and that first Easter Sunday when you walked out of a tomb. Amen.